Hi everyone, it's Gary here, and a very warm welcome back to the fourth official. With it being International Week, I thought introduce one of our esteemed guests, discovered from the city of Discovery. Warm welcome back to Nicola Ironside. Warm welcome back, Nicola.
Thank you for having me back.
So obviously, in the absence of proper football, we've had to endure international games over the course of the last week or so. But a big couple of Nations League ties for Steve Clarke, Scotland. First of all, at the weekend over in Croatia, followed up by the match on Tuesday night at Hampden against Cristiano Ronaldo's Portugal. It's fair to say that the team didn't go into these fixtures in the greatest of runs of form, in terms of since the Euros in the summer and all the lead up to that, the big games that they were playing in that, and even some of the lesser nations that Scotland played in the warm up to that tournament. 1 win in 15 against Gibraltar. And obviously the disappointment of those two ties in September against Poland and against Croatia really meant that they had to get a really good set of results to try and kind of set the tempo back in our favour. And games against Croatia away and Portugal at home on paper didn't sound as if they were going to be terribly easy games to try and get back into a little bit of form with, added to the fact that Steve Clarke's absentee list was fairly lengthy in terms of the squad for this double header. And looking back on it, a late defeat to Croatia and then a 0-0 draw against Portugal ended the rot in terms of the run of defeats, but didn't quite get the result, if not certainly the performance against Portugal, which was certainly a lot better than what we saw in September.
Yeah, definitely a lot better than September. And you're right, going into these games, I think going into the Nations League campaign itself, we're in Group A. I think most of us Scotland fans can probably agree that we're a B nation at best, probably. So these games were always going to be tough. Um, and again, lengthy injury list. So I wasn't overly disappointed with the results and the showing these past few couple of games. I actually didn't expect them to probably put in a performance as good as they did.
Yeah, and I think that that's fair. Now, Steve Clarke's copped a great deal of criticism from all quarters, particularly for his approach in the summer, which we certainly covered here on the fourth official, both on YouTube and on our Patreon channel with the coverage of that tournament. He's tried to do things a little bit differently in these games, and granted, his hand was probably forced a little bit in terms of the players that were available to him, but the fact that he seems to have abandoned the kind of five at the back shape, down to the fact, obviously, that Kieran Tierney was unavailable, and the kind of shoehorning to try and get him and Andy Robertson in the side. Certainly the balance of the team looked a lot better, albeit, as I say, against good opposition, with that kind of four at the back, the kind of flat three in the midfield, and the kind of two players supporting, whether it's London Dykes or Shea Adams. So defensively, I thought Scotland looked a lot more sound in these two games over this break than certainly we did in the summer, where we looked as if you could attack as at will. And it was always something that Steve Clarke's Kilmarnock side were renowned for, of being very difficult to break down and didn't concede very many chances. And for whatever reason, he didn't really seem to translate that into Scotland against the big nations, and we obviously copped a bit of a hiding against the Germans in that tournament, which obviously can happen. They're a quality side, but they then weren't able to kind of lift it and turn it round. And I just don't think he ever really got the balance correct in terms of personnel and shape. But starting to see signs, obviously, Cal McGregor's retirement forced his hand a little bit in terms of his midfield options, and with Billy Gilmore and Scott McTominay now being club mates at Napoli, the formation of a partnership between them starting to really start to look very, very promising from a national perspective.
Yeah, definitely. Billy Gilmore for me looked gave a very, very sound performance against Croatia, and again last night was just so, he's just so composed on the ball. And McTominay, I can't sing his praises enough, especially in a Scotland shirt. I think he's just a class act for us. I do think coming into November, maybe not so much November, but I do think when the injuries do start to come back, he's probably going to give himself a bit of a headache, because you've got Lewis Ferguson obviously returning. You would hope that, albeit Kenny McLean had a great game last night, that's sort of him back out the squad. I would assume Lewis Ferguson would be straight back in there.
Up for grabs, you would think, in there. McLean certainly not the future in terms of that kind of midfield position, and you would imagine someone like a Ferguson or one of the young guns from the under-21s who will come on to, but you've got the likes of Lennon Miller there, Connor Barron, and for me that's one thing that he has to start doing in terms of looking towards the World Cup qualifying campaign and getting some of these promising youngsters into the squad or into the team, because actually Ben Doak didn't do himself any harm in terms of his performance in these two games, albeit Scotland, I think, did look a little bit toothless, particularly against Portugal last night. Shea Adams, once again, up top on his own, cut a very isolated figure. And listen, that is probably not his fault that he didn't have a huge amount of service, but whether you had him or whether you'd Shankland or Kevin Nisbet, I don't really think that the player really matters when the shape is not necessarily there to be able to support the kind of lone striker. But to be able to win games, you need to score goals, and you need to get people in the top end of the park to cause teams a problem. And I just think, aside from maybe that first half hour against Croatia, Scotland didn't really cause too many problems going the other way.
It's one criticism I think I've always had of Steve Clarke. I'm all at the minute of after the Euros leaning more towards, I would rather see Steve Clarke go, bring in a new manager and freshen up, new ideas, freshen it up. And it's always one criticism I've had, that he is a very, very defensive setup. And going into the Euros, and I never questioned our ability to score goals. It was always the defence that worried me. And now, Nations League campaign, I'm thinking, well, okay, we're only losing games by one goal. The defence is actually showing up okay. We've had individual mistakes in these games, and I probably don't agree with the personnel he's playing at the back, but I'm disappointed in what we're creating up top. Yeah. And again, it just always seems to, we just feel like we're always relying on Scott McTominay. I think that's where we think the goals are coming from, but the man isn't capable of doing everything.
Yeah, and I think before that it was John McGinn who was the guy that was looked upon to get you the goals, and certainly as his form's tailed off, and obviously he's now been out injured and not been available for this squad. That's where you have to start looking at players from the outside, and we've obviously seen Doak really show up terribly well. The likes of Lewis Morgan, Ryan Gold, who are doing very well over in the States, and I'll get your take on Ryan Gold in a minute as a Dundonian. I'd be interested to get your opinion on what he can bring to the table. But just in terms of that kind of striker option, I think he got it the wrong way around. I thought Adams was probably a better option for Croatia than Dykes was, and Dykes was probably better against the big centre backs that Portugal had. And for me, I think he had it the wrong way around.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with you. I think you could see last night, it was as expected. We were never going to have possession of the ball. I think we were always going to sit in a deep shape. But you could see at times that when we were trying to play the ball out, we were losing it in that midfield area, and we were just inviting pressure back on ourselves. We definitely, I agree, needed Lyndon Dykes up there. If you're going long, he does have the capability to bring the ball down and bring others into the game. I can't say I was overly impressed by his performance against Croatia. But again, it's probably, like you say, that was probably a game more leaning towards Che Adams, who could put a bit more pressure, do a bit more running.
Yeah, a bit more mobile. Yeah,
Yeah.
and you look at Portugal's defence last night, players like Ruben Diaz, they were just able to soak up that high ball, win it every time, and Scotland didn't have an out ball, particularly down the channels. So they had to try and start building from midfield, try and get down the flanks. And I know it's not natural really for Ryan Christie to kind of play as a winger, but he has always been someone that's got a goal in him, although not necessarily showed too much of it last night against Portugal. But the one thing that I think you've always seen with the Scotland side, particularly against better sides, so your Portugals, your Croatias, your Englands, is that sort of siege mentality, which I think seems to support some of the players that we've got. Players like John Souttar, who was immense last night, and his role at the back. Previously, Scott McKenna, very similar type of defender that's great at throwing his body in the line, but you ask him to do something else, he's probably not got that skill set. Ryan Porteous, very similar as well. And for all his criticism, Grant Hanley is another one who is kind of rose head first and ask questions later, but that kind of lends itself to that type of game last night where you are looking to try and soak up the pressure and not concede an awful lot of territory for players like Ronaldo and Diego Jota, Bruno Fernandes. They didn't have as much as they did a lot of the ball. They weren't really able to get proper shots down on Craig Gordon's goal, and probably aside from that kind of late kind of surge and Nicky Devlin's brilliant challenge in the last kind of couple of minutes to save the point, never really looked that much threatening. And granted, Craig Gordon, and we'll talk about whether or not he's the answer in terms of goalkeeping, with Angus Gunn not there, but wasn't massively troubled, particularly last night. And you saw the likes of Cristiano Ronaldo cutting a very frustrated figure at the end of the game because they didn't get it all their own way.
Yeah, I like I say, I have to say, last night I think the defence was incredible, and the saves that Gordon had made, he was impressive with them, and it's definitely for me a step in the right direction when you are playing like the likes of Portugal's front three. And you're limiting. We certainly limited Portugal to passing the ball around in midfield. Okay, and they went down the channels, but the crosses were getting stopped or they were getting cleared. And my only issue again last night was, and again with personnel, was we don't really have that ball playing centre half. I think Suter did try and take up that position last night, and he definitely deserved man of the match for me. But when you don't have somebody who's playing that week in, week out, and if they get caught, you're massively out of shape for the inviting the pressure back on again.
Yeah, and obviously I've seen John Souttar at very close quarters all season, and probably aside from the Lyon game where pretty much everyone from a Rangers perspective took a bit of a hiding that night. John Souttar's actually stepped up pretty well this season. He's looked pretty solid, looks very much as if he's more comfortable, certainly on that right-hand side of the defence than where he was on the left-hand side last year to was accommodated when Connor Goldson was there. So he's starting to grow in stature, grow in confidence, and for a player who was obviously left out of the Euro squad in the summer, he's put his hand up to say, look, I want to be first pick for you, and performances like he had last night will certainly not do him any harm with that, because as you say, the likes of Hanley, McKenna, Porteous, none of them really kind of stand out to say, I'm your man and I'm going to play every time that the squad's picked.
Yeah, and I understand probably that at the minute Suter and Hanley have probably got a partnership going on, and that's probably why they are the centre half pairing. I don't think I would agree with that pairing, and I don't think most Scotland fans will. I know, granted, Hanley did have a good game last night, but he has been the master of a few mistakes recently. So for me, I would really like to see Liam Lindsay in there. If you're going to call him up, I want to see what he's made of. and everybody's been screaming for him to be called up for a while now. And one thing Scotland do is they make such a big deal about these players getting called up for the first time, and most of them sit on the bench for both games and don't get a sniff. I'd like to see them be put in there. You've called them up for a reason. You obviously think they're good enough.
Yeah, because those did that with Conor Barron for last night, and then he doesn't get on the pitch, and it's he could have still been in Kazakhstan and helping the under 21s in that game. So if you're not going to play him, don't have him there. And I think that's certainly an argument that we can have. Speaking about the kind of younger players in and around the squad, we spoke about Ben Doak, really, really impressive. Another one who, as I say, really standing up is Ryan Gold, a player who's probably been kind of criminally underlooked by Scotland for a number of years now, but played very well, as he has done for several years now over in the States. And whilst he's quite light in terms of stature, that kind of creative influence from the top end of the park. I know he didn't get a huge amount of time last night to really show what he's capable of, but something a bit different for this kind of Scotland squad that doesn't necessarily have a huge amount of creativity in it. And I just wonder whether or not the games in November maybe give us a proper opportunity, because by this stage you know exactly what a Ryan Christie can do, you know what Kenny McLean can do. Is the fact that we're probably now out of this tournament, is it a chance to go, right, well, let's experiment against good opposition, give some players an opportunity to play international football and have a proper look at them, rather than giving them 10-15 minutes at the end of the game to replace old legs. Because you're not going to learn any more about a Ryan Christie or a Stuart Armstrong or someone like that by continuing to play them in a game that really doesn't really mean that much now.
No, and I would love to say that yes, he will, but I think mathematically, because we can still finish, I think we can actually still finish second, funnily enough.
Still finish second if we win both games, but that requires a lot of things, I think, to go Scotland's way. So it's...
No, I totally agree, but I think mathematically, because there is still that option, I think Steve Clarke will stick to his regulars. I think obviously Gordon and the likes of Gordon, Lewis Morgan will get called up, but I'd be very surprised if we've seen them play any more than 20 minutes a game. I would love to see Ryan Goldstein. I actually thought that he maybe would have started them against Portugal, and like you say, we haven't had enough time to see completely what he's capable of, but he certainly has shown it in flashes. And obviously the equaliser was ruled offside, but it was his creativity that essentially set the one up as well before, where Adams lobbed it just over there. But he's definitely shown it in flashes, and I think God has shown that throughout his whole career. He was the wonder kid when he was at United, and I think it's a shame to say, but I think moving to at the MLS has probably put a bit of a dampener on his Scotland career. For some reason, I don't know why, but it feels like that league's just looked down upon. Like, it's not that great, so but you could probably do it there. So are you really good enough to be called up for Scotland? But you've called other
Jack
players
Henry for long enough playing in Saudi Arabia, so
I agree. But he's definitely worth a start for me. I think if you're not going to do it now, then when are you going to do it? Because these boys actually aren't classed as young boys anymore. These boys are 20, coming on 27, 28. That they're probably at the peak of their career, but World Cup, they're then teetering off to late 20s, early 30s, and that's probably not what we're shouting for when it comes to the World Cup.
And that's why everyone's so excited about Ben Doak. You look at Lamine Yamal, and no one's comparing Ben Doak to Lamine Yamal, but they are confident enough to play him as a 16-year-old in a World Cup final, so we can play a Ben Doak or a Nathan Patterson, players like that, get them in the side. And let's be fair, Nathan Patterson's not been fit now for over a year, but he's someone that certainly's got the skill set to be able to come in and be better than Anthony Ralston can give you in a kind of right back perspective. got to be fair to Anthony Ralston, he had a tough time in September, but actually over these 2 games, he stood up relatively well. No one's, I think, under any illusions that Anthony Ralston is anything more than what he is, but he stood up and did his job against a tricky opponent last night, and he can at least kind of come off the park with his head held high. And because of that, Nicky Devlin came on and got his first Scotland cap. And again, you've got Jack McKenzie, who got his first Scotland call-up off the back of his great start at the season up at Aberdeen. And as you say, we've got to start having a look at some of these kind of younger players to see whether or not they can make the step up to international level, because there will become a time where you can't keep going to the well for your Grant Hanleys and your Kenny McLeans, and you need to start bringing through the next generation. And that brings me on to the goalkeepers. Obviously, Angus Gunn, very much the Scotland number one, unavailable for these 2 games, so they went back to the Old Faithful and Craig Gordon. The other options, really, there weren't too many. Obviously, John McCracken is a player who you've been very vocal about on socials over the last few weeks, so we'll get your take on him. But other than that, Robbie McCrory not really getting a game at Kilmarnock. Liam Kelly nowhere near the Rangers first team now, very much back up to Jack Butland. There isn't a huge amount of other options, and that's why he's probably had to go back to Craig Gordon. Obviously, Xander Clarke is another one who's been in and out the Hearts team this season, a Hearts team who've barely won a game all season, so you can maybe understand that as well, why they've gone back to Gordon. What is it about McCracken? You've obviously seen him all year, and as I say, you've been very vocal about him on socials. So for people that haven't seen too much of him, where's that criticism came from? Because obviously Clarke sees something in him to call him up to the squad.
Yeah, don't want to be too vocal, but he's a young. Do you know what? McCracken is a young player, and there is no doubt at some point in his career he will probably he will get better. But for right now, for me, domestically, John McCracken has cost Dundee at least a goal a game. I know it's the easy saying, but it is. It's Poppadom wrists. He just lets the ball go right through him. It's like, for me, he never makes a save that I don't expect him to make. I'm never coming out of a game and I'm going, oh my God, what a save. Can't believe he's done that. And then there's some of the saves that I do expect him to make go right under him, or he tries to save with his leg, and we're all sitting there like, I'm not really sure what your thought process is on this. I also don't think he's that vocal when it comes to speaking to his centre halves. And I know we can all use the excuse of Dundee centre halves are not English, one's French, one's Mexican, but that you train on that every week, like, do you know what I mean, every day? So I just don't really see him as vocal enough. And last but not least, pretty much, don't get me wrong, he's had a few assists this season, and I would praise him for the goal kicks that have turned into assists, but I would say that 80% of his goal kicks go straight up the park.
Which I think from a Scotland perspective, it just comes straight back the way, because there's no one at the top end of the park to kind of hold it down or to do something with. But yeah, signs of optimism, I think. I think most people from a Scotland persuasion went into these 2 games over this break expecting probably 2 defeats. That didn't happen. Scotland have never lost 6 games in a row, and with the draw against Portugal last night, they managed to prevent that from happening. So all credit, I think, needs to go to the players for carrying out that plan. But as you say, there's still a mathematical potential to get out of the Nations League in terms of in the top 2, and that would secure them a pot 1 place in the World Cup draw. If they don't and they lose the next 2 games in the Nation League, it's very likely that they will be a pot 3 team in the draw for the World Cup qualifiers. Quite a difference there between obviously being in pot 1 and pot 3. But actually, I think from a Scotland persuasion, historically, we've always been better against better teams. If you think of the games against Norway, for example, they were able to raise their game for that. It's been the games against your Macedonias and your such likes that historically Scotland have came unstuck against. So maybe not the worst idea in the world if they do go in as a pot 3 team, but probably looking for a little bit of help in terms of the draw if that turns out to be that way, because I think winning 2-2 in the final games in November is going to be obviously a massive challenge.
It definitely is, and I think if we do end up the pot 3 team, then of course we've had experience in playing the top teams for the last 6 games in the Nations League. And I do agree, I definitely do think that we raise our game. But I think from a fan's perspective, you always want to get better. You want to be that pot 1 team, because it then comes to, well, how much more can Steve Clarke do for us? I think for me, and I said this after the under-21 defeat last night, because obviously I was aware that a lot of these boys never got called up or weren't in for a call-up to the squad because they could have qualified. But now that their kind of campaign's done and dusted, I reckon it's time for Steve Clarke to save a bit of face and call up boys like Lennon Miller, who, if you're good enough, you're old enough for me. If you're going to call up Ben Doak, Lennon Miller's the exact same age. I don't see why he can't get a chance. And like I say, because their campaign is pretty much done and dusted, then I reckon it's time that we at least give these boys a chance.
No, I totally agree, and I think it should happen. Whether or not it was the right thing to do for this international break is to keep some of those youngsters in for that qualifying games in the under-21s. But Scott Gemmell, with a very decent under-21 side, managed to quite spectacularly blow it over these 2 games to the point where it's now 25 years since Scotland have reached a major tournament at under-21 level. There's obviously been a massive clamour for Steve Clarke to potentially be replaced. For me, Scott Gemmell's another one who has to be looking over his shoulder now, because the actual talent that he's got at his disposal, there's no reason why Scotland should be losing heavily to Kazakhstan with the types of players that he was able to call up. Last time we spoke, Nicola, we spoke a lot about Lyle Cameron and the fact that his head potentially been turned a little bit by the events towards the tail end of the transfer window, and I think it's fair to say his form has massively kind of fallen off a cliff since that point. Obviously involved twice for the under-21s over this period. What does Lyle have to do to turn his form around, both on a club and now obviously country perspective, to make sure that he lives up to some of the potential that he's obviously got there?
Funny thing is, I actually think Cameron plays very, very well for his club level. I watched both of the under-21 games this break and didn't see anything wrong in Cameron's game. I thought we played very well and linked up very well with his teammate and Josh Mulligan. So it's hard to see that sometimes you watch these games and he plays really well, and then you watch him domestically at his club, and I don't know. I can't really pinpoint what's been going on. I feel like it might be a bit on the manager as well, because I feel like Lyle does start off a game really well, and I definitely, without a shadow of a doubt, he misses his partner in Luke McCowan. And especially you see it, Scotland play him a bit deeper than Dundee would play him, and he seems to thrive in that position. Whereas we're asking him to play a bit more further forward and be a bit more of a box-to-box out. And you can see it within about 70 minutes. Lyle is on his arse. He is absolutely knackered. And that then comes from the manager to make the change, and he never does. He never brings Lyle off. And I have been part of that. I have criticised Cameron, and sometimes I do look back on it and I think, okay, maybe it is a bit unfair. That was probably on the manager. We're all shouting for a sub and you're keeping him on. But I think if Dundee are to start Josh Mulligan, I think Lyle can replicate his form from Scotland to Dundee again, because they link up very well.
Yeah, we'll certainly watch up with interest over the coming weeks. But yeah, as you say, very disappointing couple of games for the under-21s, and now absolutely no excuse for Steve Clarke to start involving some of the standouts at that level. I think Lennon Miller particularly is one that should absolutely be knocking on the door. I think the one problem we probably have is that he's in that one position that Scotland are actually pretty well served in that kind of central midfield area. But for me, there's a much more upside in a Lennon Miller than, say, a Kenny McLean or a Stuart Armstrong, whose kind of time is probably, and you go, thank you very much for your service, but we need to start building towards that World Cup 26 campaign and hopefully try and get the team to that tournament. Elsewhere in the Nation League, obviously, we saw the end of the Lee Carsley experiment for England, and of day of recording, they've appointed Thomas Tuchel on a 18-month contract to obviously see them through to the World Cup. Interesting appointment, I think, from an England perspective. I think as soon as Carsley turned up with playing no strikers and 6 midfielders against Greece and coming up on a 2-1 defeat on that night, which could really have been anything, that pretty much sealed his kind of death knell for getting that job on a permanent basis. Tuchel certainly has got the CV a lot more than a Lee Carsley has, but interesting appointment that they've only given it to him for 18 months.
I think I think probably 18 months is more so because I don't think Tuchel has lasted more than 18 months in any of his recent jobs. But from me, an outsider perspective looking in and not anything to do with England, I think it's probably a great appointment. He's won 11 trophies. Like, managers don't win 11 trophies if they're not good enough. And he's managed a few of these boys. He obviously just came off the back of managing Harry Kane as well. So he knows a lot of these players, and he does play probably the type of football that would incorporate England's best players.
Yeah, it's a very English style. As much as a foreign manager, he's very much renowned as a bit of an Anglophile. So ticks a lot of the boxes in that front. I don't think we'll ever see them going with a false 9, especially with likes of Ollie Watkins and Dom Solanke on the bench as well. So Lee Carsley will go back to the England under-21s. Also want to give a bit of a shout out to Northern Ireland. A brilliant 5-0 victory for them against Bulgaria on Tuesday evening. I think for a side that's very much transitioning again towards some younger players, beating anyone 5-0 is a brilliant result. But for Northern Ireland to haven't had a result like that for an awful long time, that really should give them a bit of momentum as they obviously look ahead towards their kind of World Cup campaign. Huge victory for them.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, like you say, they're transitioning into a lot of younger players. That kind of result for me gives those players a lot of confidence and momentum going into the World Cup qualifiers, because these boys know, like, they're at the age that these boys will be in the squad for that. And I think if you start early enough and you've got team spirit in there and confidence, it can only serve you well going forward.
It was something Mike O'Neill was very good at first time round, was building that almost kind of like club-like spirit within the Northern Ireland camp. And obviously there's a lot of their experienced campaigners, like obviously Stephen Davis, Aaron Hughes, Johnny Evans, that are starting to obviously come to the end of that campaign as starting to rebuild. So obviously a little bit ahead of the game in terms of from Scotland in that perspective, but there is a little bit of synergy, I think, and we can possibly look to them for a bit of guidance in terms of how to start to integrate some of the youngsters going forward. Whether or not Steve Clarke does that or not, we will watch with interest when the next international break comes round in about 3 weeks' time, as is the nature of this. But the good news is after that, then that's us till March, and a big diet of club football between now and the Christmas period, and we will certainly keep you all up to date and abreast of all the goings on in and around Scottish football here on the 4th Official, both on our Patreon channel and also on YouTube. Big thank you to Nicola for lending her considerable opinions and talent once again to the channel and the network. aside from joining us on occasion here on the Fourth Official, you can also catch her on the brilliant Salmon's Pizzeria, which we've certainly borrowed a few bodies from over the course of the last couple of months, and you'll certainly see a few more names and bodies from that particular area over the coming weeks here on the Fourth Official as well. As always, a big thank you to you all for listening. I'll speak to you next time. Goodbye.